My name is Mary. I'm 66 years old, and at my husband Harold's funeral, I got a message that froze me to the bone. It said, "I'm alive." My hands shook as I replied, "That's not you in the casket. Who is this?" The answer came fast. "I can't say. They're watching. Don't trust our sons." I swear my heart stopped. I stood there staring at the phone in disbelief while just a few feet away, the priest droned on about eternal rest and peace. How could Harold be texting me when Harold was lying right there in that box, lowered into the cold, wet ground? I looked up, my eyes searching, and there they were, Daniel and Peter, my sons. My boys, standing in their pressed black suits, their arms folded, their faces set in stone. They didn't look broken. They didn't look like two men burying their father. They looked distant, calculating. The message burned in my mind. Don't trust our sons. I shoved the phone back into my coat pocket, forcing myself to breathe. My legs felt like jelly. The funeral ended, people came and went, their words of sympathy brushing past me like wind. I nodded, smiled weakly, said thank you when I could, but inside, I was screaming. Back at the house, I thought maybe Daniel and Peter would sit with me. Maybe they'd ask if I wanted tea. Maybe they'd remind me of the good times with Harold. Instead, the moment we walked through the door, they went straight into business, talking about insurance, policies, the bike shop, property. Not a single word about the man we had just buried. Not a tear. Not even a flicker of pain in their eyes. I sat there, my hands folded so tightly in my lap that my knuckles ached, listening to my sons talk about money, while my heart was breaking. And I kept hearing that message over and over in my head. I'm alive. Don't trust our sons. That night, when the house was finally quiet, I pulled the note out again. The glow from my phone screen was the only light in the room. My husband, of 40 years, the man I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, was supposedly gone, and yet someone out there wanted me to believe he wasn't. And I'll ask you, what would you do if you were me? Would you have dismissed it as a cruel trick? Or would you have let it dig its claws into your chest, the way it did with me, leaving you wide awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the very children you raised could be hiding the darkest secret of all? That was the beginning. The first crack in the world I thought I knew. And once the crack started, there was no stopping the break. To understand why that message hit me so hard, you have to know who Harold was to me. He wasn't just my husband. He was the anchor of my entire life. I met Harold when I was 24 in the small town of Cedar Grove. Back then, life was simple, almost painfully simple. I worked at a little fabric shop, sewing custom dresses and curtains for whoever could afford them. Money was always tight, but I liked the work. It kept my hands busy and gave me a reason to keep dreaming. Harold walked into that shop one Saturday afternoon carrying a bicycle tire under his arm. He was covered in grease, wearing a faded blue shirt, his hair falling into his eyes. He asked if we had any strong thread he could use to patch a torn canvas bag. I remember laughing because his hands were so dirty he left smudges on the counter. Most women I knew would have been put off by that. Not me. There was something honest about him, something real. From that day on, he started showing up more often. At first it was for little things, patches, fabric scraps. Then it became excuses. He'd linger at the counter, asking about my day, telling me about his bicycle repair shop, how he'd started it with nothing but a few tools and a lot of grit. He had this smile that made you believe everything would be okay, no matter how bad things got. We married a year later. No big wedding, no fancy honeymoon, just a simple ceremony at the town hall, followed by cake and coffee with a handful of friends. But I didn't need more. I had him, and that was enough. Life was hard in those early years. Harold worked from sunrise to sunset, fixing bikes, and I took sewing jobs whenever I could. We lived in a tiny two-bedroom house that always smelled faintly of oil and fabric softener. The wallpaper peeled in places, the floor creaked, but it was home. And together, we built a family. Daniel came first. Strong-willed from the start, always reaching for things, always demanding more. Then Peter, quieter, softer, but with eyes that absorbed everything. My boys were my world. For a long time, we were happy, even though we never had much. We ate simple meals, celebrated birthdays with homemade cakes, and spent evenings crowded around the radio, listening to old music while Harold tapped his foot and hummed along. It wasn't perfect, what family is, but it was ours. That's why Harold's death and that message at his funeral tore me apart. Because everything we had, everything we built, was supposed to mean something. We taught our boys about love, about loyalty, about sticking together when times got tough. But as the years passed, I started to notice cracks. Daniel and Peter grew distant. They wanted more than the modest life we had given them. More money, more status, more recognition. They went off to the city, found their careers, bought their suits and shiny cars. And when they came back to visit, they looked at us differently. At me. At Harold. Almost like they were embarrassed by us. I'd see it in Daniel's smirk when he'd talk about investments, or in Peter's silence when his wife Angela made a snide remark about our little house smelling like old wood and grease. Visits became fewer, conversations grew shorter. That warmth, that bond we worked so hard to build, it was slipping away. I told myself it was just life. Children grow up. They move on. But deep down, it felt like a betrayal, like they were rewriting their story, cutting Harold and me out of the chapters that mattered most. And yet, through all of that, Harold never changed. He still went to his shop every morning, still came home smelling of metal and oil, still teased me about working too hard at my sewing table. He loved us, in his steady, quiet way, until the day they told me he was gone. That's why that message haunted me. Because if Harold was really alive, if something darker was hiding beneath the surface, then everything I thought I understood about my sons, my family, my marriage would unravel. And trust me, it did. As the years rolled on, things started to change in ways I didn't want to see at first. For so long, I clung to the idea that family was unbreakable, that no matter what paths my sons chose, the bond we built in that little house would always hold. But bonds can fray, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. And with Daniel and Peter, it was like watching threads slip through my fingers one by one. When they were boys, our home was filled with laughter. Harold would chase them around the yard, their squeals echoing down the street. I'd scold them for tracking mud inside, and Harold would wink at me as if to say, "Let 'em be boys." We were poor, yes, but there was love in every corner of that house. But once Daniel and Peter got older, once they saw the wider world, It was as though they decided love wasn't enough. Daniel went off first. He was ambitious, always had been. He landed a job in finance in the city, the kind where a slick suit mattered more than the sweat on your brow. He came back for visits, but not the same way he used to. His words got sharper, colder. He'd roll his eyes when Harold talked about the shop. He'd make little jokes about my sewing, like it was something beneath him. And Peter followed not long after. He had a softer nature, but city life hardened him too. He got into marketing, surrounded himself with polished people who talked more about brands and status than anything real. And then there was Angela, his wife. The moment she entered our lives, I felt the ground shift beneath me. She wasn't cruel outright, not at first, but every visit came with comments that cut deep. "This place smells like oil," she'd say, wrinkling her nose. Or, "Mary, you still sew your own curtains? That's quaint." Always with that smile, the kind that wasn't really a smile at all. Harold would squeeze my hand under the table as she spoke, as if to remind me not to rise to the bait. But I felt it. The disdain, the quiet mockery. Our family dinners turned into obligations. Daniel and Peter would come, but their eyes stayed glued to their phones, or they'd talk about things Harold and I couldn't relate to. Stocks, business trips, new restaurants. They looked at us like relics from another time, something to be tolerated, but not embraced. What hurt most wasn't the words, though. It was the absence. The calls that stopped coming. The birthdays they missed. The way holidays shifted from being filled with laughter and warmth to hurried visits that felt like chores on their calendars. I tried to tell myself it was normal. Children grow up, they build their own lives. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't just distance. It was disdain. They were ashamed of us, of Harold with his grease-stained hands, of me with my homemade dresses and patched tablecloths. They wanted more. Money, status, recognition, and they wanted it so badly that our love no longer mattered. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering where I went wrong. Did I smother them? Did we not give enough? Or was it simply that we gave too much, made life too easy in our own small way, and they decided it wasn't enough to measure up to the world? Harold never said much about it. He'd just sigh, wipe his hands on a rag after a long day at the shop and say, "They'll come around, Mary. They're just finding their way." But I saw the flicker of hurt in his eyes, the way he'd linger in the boys' rooms sometimes, standing in silence, looking at the trophies, the posters, the memories of when we were still a family. And that's what makes the message I received at his funeral cut so deep. Because a part of me already knew, already feared that my sons weren't the boys I once raised, that the bond I believed in had already rotted. And if someone was warning me not to trust them, then maybe I wasn't just paranoid. Maybe the love I thought was unshakable had already turned into something far darker. As time went on, the visits grew shorter and colder. What used to be full of laughter, storytelling, and the smell of Harold's cooking turned into quiet, uncomfortable affairs. Daniel and Peter would arrive, shake my hand with a stiff smile, and immediately start checking their phones, scrolling through emails, texts, social media. They weren't present. Not really. Angela, Peter's wife, seemed to take particular joy in highlighting the differences between their world and ours. I remember one Thanksgiving, our little dining room barely fit all of us, but I'd spent the whole morning preparing a roast, mashed potatoes, and my famous pumpkin pie. She walked in, looked around and said, "It smells rustic in here." And then she laughed, lightly, but I could feel the weight in her words. Harold's eyes flickered with hurt, and mine wanted to burn with anger. But we smiled, because we had to. Daniel would chime in with a joke about the vintage furniture or antique appliances, and Peter would nod, smirking. I remember sitting at the table, pretending to pass the gravy, feeling my chest tighten with every word. I wanted to tell them to leave, to get out, to stop disrespecting the only home Harold and I had built. But I didn't. I couldn't. I wanted to believe they were just distracted, busy, that this was life, and maybe deep down they still loved us. But it didn't stop. Birthdays became hurried visits with generic gifts. Holidays were now schedules to keep rather than moments to share. And slowly, insidiously, I began to notice it. The disdain in their tone, the impatience in their gestures, the way they would glance at each other as if silently agreeing I was beneath them. Angela wasn't subtle. She made sure I noticed every time I said something that didn't match her polished world. "Mary, do you really use that old sewing machine? There are better ways now." Or, "Harold, are you still running the shop by yourself? Surely someone more professional could help." Each comment was small but sharp, like a paper cut that wouldn't heal. And then there were the silences. Those unbearable silences when they'd sit across from me, pretending to eat while I tried to make conversation. Questions about my health, my days, my feelings, never asked. The warmth, the connection, the family I once knew, it had been replaced with cold observation, as if they were studying two relics from a life they had no interest in keeping. I would sometimes catch Daniel glancing at Peter, almost laughing quietly at something Angela had whispered. And I'd think, are they really my sons? The boys I raised to value loyalty, kindness, and hard work? Or are they people I barely know, molded by ambition and the desire for a life far removed from everything Harold and I ever taught them? It hurt in a way I couldn't explain. Not just because of their distance, but because it felt like betrayal. And yet I clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, they were still our children at heart, that if life threw the right challenge at them, they'd remember their roots. But I was wrong. And the first hint of that truth would hit me harder than I ever imagined. It all started the day Harold didn't come home from the shop. I remember pacing the house, the clock ticking louder than usual, my stomach twisting into knots. By the time the hospital called, my heart was already hammering against my ribs. Harold had supposedly fallen in the shop. A simple accident, they said. He tripped on a loose board, hit his head, nothing more. But something didn't feel right. The way Daniel and Peter showed up almost immediately, their crisp suits and polished shoes, their eyes scanning for more than just their father's condition, it set my nerves on fire. They didn't ask how I was holding up. They didn't hug me or hold my hand. They asked questions about insurance, medical bills, and who would manage the shop if things went wrong. I watched them, my stomach turning as they spoke in calm, calculated tones like they were discussing a business deal rather than the life of their father. And Harold was barely conscious, lying on a gurney, his face pale, bruised, and confused. The contrast made my blood boil. Something was off. I tried to brush it away at first. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe grief was making me paranoid. But deep down, I knew the truth was closer than I wanted to admit. I had raised these boys, fed them, loved them, and yet I was starting to see cracks I had never noticed before. Even in the hospital room, Daniel and Peter didn't waver from their focus on money. Daniel asked about the life insurance policy. Peter inquired whether selling the shop would cover any debts Harold might leave behind. I could barely speak. My husband, the man who had built everything with his hands, was lying broken in front of us, and they were thinking of nothing but profit. And then it happened. The first thing that made me truly suspect something sinister. While the doctors were tending to Harold, I received a text from an unknown number, one I didn't recognize. It said, "Watch them closely. They aren't who you think they are." I felt my chest tighten. My hands shook. I looked over at my sons, pretending to check their phones, nodding along with doctors, calm, collected, perfectly composed. Could it be true? Could they have done something? My mind raced, refusing to believe that the boys I raised, my flesh and blood, could ever harm Harold. But the words on my phone burned like fire. They aren't who you think they are. I left the hospital that night with Harold barely conscious, his arm in a sling, his face pale and drawn. Daniel and Peter left soon after, promising to handle things, to make sure everything went smoothly. Their smiles didn't reach their eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that beneath those calm expressions, something darker was brewing. And as I sat alone in the house that night, staring at the empty chair where Harold should have been laughing, something inside me shifted. I knew, just knew, that the days ahead would be nothing like the quiet, simple life we had lived. Something had changed, something terrible, and it was coming from the very people I had trusted most. I couldn't shake it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Harold lying in that hospital bed, pale and weak, and I heard the calm, calculated voices of Daniel and Peter discussing money like vultures circling a dying man. Something wasn't right. I had raised them. I knew their patterns, their little quirks, but now I didn't recognize them. A few nights later, my phone buzzed again, another unknown number. The message was short, cold, and deliberate. Don't trust your sons. They planned this. Get proof before it's too late. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Proof? What kind of proof, and how? Who could I trust? I felt like the ground had been pulled from under me. I couldn't go to the police yet, not without evidence, and I certainly couldn't confront Daniel and Peter. Not yet. I needed help. I needed someone outside the family, someone who could see things clearly. That's when I found Stephen Callahan, a private investigator with a reputation for handling the messy, dangerous cases no one else would touch. I met him in a small office, the kind of place with stacks of case files, a faded map on the wall, and the smell of strong coffee lingering in the air. Stephen didn't ask many questions at first. He listened, nodded, and then said something that sent chills down my spine. "Mary, if your instincts are right, you're dealing with people capable of anything. We have to move carefully." And we did. Slowly, methodically, we began to uncover the evidence that would change everything. Audio recordings, financial documents, photos, pieces of a puzzle that didn't make sense until they were all laid out. It was horrifying. Daniel and Peter had been planning this for months. The accident at the shop wasn't an accident at all. They had plotted to poison Harold to make it look like a simple workplace mishap. Methanol slipped into his lunch or his drink, something invisible, lethal, carefully calculated to simulate a fall and a fainted state. It was meant to look like misfortune, but the truth was far darker. And the more Stephen dug, the clearer it became. Every move, every conversation, every seemingly innocent visit was part of a strategy. They manipulated insurance policies, bank accounts, everything they could get their hands on. They weren't just careless or distant. They were cold, calculated, and ruthless. I remember sitting in the car outside their offices one evening, the rain streaking the windshield, my heart pounding. Stephen turned to me and said, "Mary, I've never seen a case like this. Your sons, they planned this down to the smallest detail." I didn't want to believe it, but the proof was there. Each document, each recording, each photograph screamed the same thing. Betrayal so deep, so absolute, it left me breathless. My own children, the boys I had raised with love and care, were capable of trying to kill their father for money. And in that moment, a part of me shifted. Fear turned to rage. Pain turned to determination. I realized then that I couldn't just sit back and let this go. I had to act. I had to fight. Not just for Harold, but for myself, for the life we had built together and for the truth that needed to be seen. I couldn't sit back any longer. Every night, I replayed the messages, the recordings, the documents Stephen had collected. Every detail of Daniel and Peter's betrayal burned in my chest. I had loved them, raised them, sacrificed everything for them, and now they had tried to take everything from me and Harold. I knew I had to move. The next morning, I walked into the police station with Stephen by my side. I carried the evidence like a shield, like armor against the disbelief I was certain I'd face. The officers looked at me with polite sympathy at first, the kind you give to someone grieving a tragedy. But when I laid the proof on the desk, the emails, the insurance documents, the recordings, their eyes widened. The case was bigger than they imagined. I remember the first time I heard the words murder and conspiracy said in relation to my sons. My stomach turned, but my hands didn't shake anymore. The fear that had gripped me when I got that first message was now replaced with a cold, hard clarity. These men who had once been my boys would pay for what they had tried to do. And the weeks that followed were a blur of police interviews, legal filings, and court dates. Daniel and Peter tried to act surprised, hurt, even outraged that I would accuse them. Their fake outrage made my blood boil. They were so confident they could manipulate everything, but they hadn't counted on me. They hadn't counted on the fact that I could see through the lies, that I could fight with the same quiet determination I had used to build my life with Harold.
The trial was brutal. The courtroom was packed, whispers filling the air as neighbors and friends tried to understand how a mother could accuse her own sons of something so horrific. But when the evidence was presented, the photos, the audio, the bank transfers, the meticulous planning, it all became undeniable. I watched Daniel and Peter from the gallery. Their faces lost color. Angela sat beside Peter, her expression twisted with disbelief and panic. And I felt something strange, almost foreign, rise inside me. A sense of relief. Justice was finally moving. The betrayal that had kept me awake at night, gnawing at my heart, was about to be exposed in front of everyone. When the verdict came down, Daniel was convicted and sentenced to life. Peter, unable to cope with the weight of everything, suffered a mental breakdown and was institutionalized. Angela disappeared from our lives entirely. The sons I had loved, the boys I had raised, were gone. Not just physically, but morally. They had been replaced with strangers I never wanted to see again. I stood outside the courthouse afterward, breathing in the crisp air, feeling the rain on my face. I thought about Harold, about the life we had built, and I whispered a quiet promise. I will honor you. I will make sure no one ever suffers at the hands of greed and betrayal like this again. And in that moment, the fear, the grief, and the anger began to blend into something else. Peace. The peace of knowing that I had fought for what was right, that the truth had been revealed, and that justice, though imperfect, had been served. After the trial, the house felt different, lighter somehow. The shadows of betrayal that had clung to every corner were finally lifted, though the wounds ran deep.
Daniel was gone, locked away in a prison cell for life. Peter had been committed, his mind fragile from the weight of guilt and exposure. And Angela, she vanished like smoke, leaving behind only the memory of her disdain and cruelty. I wandered through the rooms that had once been filled with laughter and arguments, remembering every moment. Every birthday cake, every scraped knee, every late-night conversation about school or dreams or hopes. It hurt to know those boys, my sons, had been replaced with strangers capable of planning my husband's murder. But I also realized that life, no matter how broken, can be rebuilt. Harold's bicycle shop became my sanctuary. I turned the old workshop into a small garden, planting flowers where grease-stained benches once stood. The smell of earth replaced the smell of oil. The soft green of leaves replaced the gray metal and concrete. It wasn't just a tribute to Harold. It was a declaration of life, of growth, of something beautiful rising from betrayal.
I also decided to act beyond myself. With the money and resources left untouched by my son's schemes, I founded a small family crime aid foundation. It wasn't big, and it wasn't flashy, but it helped people who had been hurt by betrayal, abuse, or greed. People whose lives had been upended by the very people they trusted most. Through it all, I found strength I didn't know I had. Friends, neighbors, even strangers reached out, inspired by what I had endured and how I had fought back. And slowly, I began to feel peace. Not the hollow peace that comes from ignoring pain, but the quiet, firm peace that comes from truth, justice, and the knowledge that I had survived, and I had done so with dignity. I'd be lying if I said the memories didn't sting. I still remember the coldness in Daniel's eyes, the whisper of Angela's mockery, the betrayal that ran so deep it almost broke me. But I also remember the resilience that kept me moving forward, the clarity that let me see my sons for who they really were, and the justice that finally gave me a voice when theirs had tried to silence everything Harold and I had built. And in the quiet moments, when the garden blooms and the sunlight filters through the house we built together, I feel Harold's presence. I feel the love that made me fight, that gave me courage when fear threatened to take over. And I know that even in the face of unimaginable betrayal, life can be reclaimed, and peace can be found, even if it comes with scars that will never fully fade. Looking back now, I see everything more clearly. Life taught me some harsh lessons I wish I hadn't needed to learn the hard way. I learned that true family isn't always defined by blood. It's defined by love, loyalty, and respect. Daniel and Peter had my blood, but they had none of those things. They taught me that greed can poison even the closest bonds, and that people you trust most can be capable of unimaginable betrayal. But I also learned something else. I learned the power of courage, of refusing to stay silent when wrongs are done. I learned that even in the darkest moments, it's possible to fight back, to reclaim your life, and to protect the truth. That's why I founded the Family Crime Aid Foundation. I wanted others to know that they aren't powerless, that there is hope, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, can be found. Friends often ask me how I survived it all, how I faced my son's betrayal, how I navigated the courtrooms, how I kept going when everything I loved had been threatened. And I tell them, I survived because I had no choice. Because love, real love, doesn't die, even when betrayal tries to snuff it out.
because I wanted Harold's legacy, the life we built together, to mean something. I think back to those messages from that unknown number, the warnings that started it all. At the time, they terrified me, but now I see them as a gift, a nudge, a lifeline, a reminder that instinct matters. Sometimes the truth hides in the smallest, quietest signs, and sometimes it takes all the courage you have to follow it. My life continues now with dignity and purpose. I walk through the garden where Harold's shop once stood, tending to the flowers, feeling the sun on my face, and hearing the faint echo of his laughter in the wind. I have friends who became family, people who supported me when the people who should have protected me did the opposite. And I share my story, not to dwell in pain, but to warn others. Love fiercely, but always with boundaries. Trust, but verify, and never accept harm disguised as love. Because in the end, it's not the betrayal that defines us. It's how we rise after it. It's how we reclaim our lives, our dignity, and our peace. It's how we choose to live, even when the people who should have been our closest allies turned out to be our greatest enemies. And that is my story, my warning, my testament, my victory. Even now, decades later, the memories come back, not always in nightmares, but sometimes in quiet moments when I'm tending the garden or sitting with a cup of coffee in the morning light. I think about Harold, about the life we built, about the laughter, the struggles, the love that carried us through every storm. And I think about Daniel and Peter and the choices they made that changed everything. I've learned that betrayal doesn't just hurt, it teaches. It forces you to see the world and the people around you with new eyes. It teaches you the value of trust, the fragility of family, and the strength you didn't know you had. I've learned that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's simply standing your ground, insisting on the truth, and refusing to let injustice win. The garden where Harold's shop once stood blooms every spring, a reminder that life goes on, that beauty can rise from the darkest places, and that love leaves a mark that no betrayal can erase. The foundation I built in his honor continues to help families hurt by greed and betrayal, giving them hope and a voice when they feel powerless. I have friends now who are my chosen family, people who stood by me when my sons turned away, who reminded me that love and loyalty still exist in this world. And through it all, I've learned a truth I carry every day. Protect yourself, trust wisely, and never accept harm disguised as care. So I tell my story, not for revenge, not for pity, but as a warning, a lesson, and a testament. Life can change in a heartbeat. People you love can betray you, but the choices you make afterward, the way you fight back, the way you protect your heart and your dignity, that defines you. I am Mary. I survived. I fought. I reclaimed my life, and I am finally at peace.